Reports here at TopVelocity.net. I'm doing pitching notes here, Matt. This is from this 3x pitching velocity camp. This is a BioMetric Analysis. So coming out of leg lift, you can see the back or the drive hip and femur are not abducting. So if we look at the hip angles in this position, we can see the left hip abduction is about 15 degrees. So high velocity pitcher at this point probably be more like 30. It's at 22, and you can see because of that the femur is internally rotated. We want that femur externally rotated. So working on that abduction issue. Is it a strength issue? Is it a mobility issue? And we can see that that femur is turned down, so that knee is turning down the drive leg, which is going to cause the hip rotation to go early. It's going to cause power it's going to reduce power, because when you start rotating, you can't push against the rubber. You can't push as well. So at this point here, pretty much everything's starting to go open into front foot, and you can see at front foot there's actually a good amount of hip rotation. So and that's the one thing, you can get a lot of hip rotation when you go early. The problem is you're not really powering a lot of rotation. So it's kind of like you're going to roll a ball down a hill or a wheel down a hill, and if you just let go early, it will get down the hill. But when it gets down to the bottom of the hill, it's not going to have as much force on it. If I stayed with it and I kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, say I even took longer to get it going, but at the end it'd have a lot more momentum. That's the thing here. I know we don't have a lot of time, but if we start rotating right out of leg lift, we can really decrease the amount of inertia that we can put behind the movement. And that's what you're going to see here, Matt. So at front foot strike, even though as the hips open, good, let's look at the hip line, shoulder line, good timing of hip to shoulder separation. So good job of pulling them apart. You can see these two lines are apart. The challenge is going to be as the hip fully opens, how far do they stay apart? And you can see the shoulders already catching up. So even though there's great timing of how as the back knee is going down, the back elbow is pulling up, I'll use the drawing tool to show what I'm talking about, but this is really important. You can see this, as this drives down, the elbow loads the scap up, and that's great, that's optimal. And if I kind of go through that movement, you can see them going against each other, and that creates, in the separation aspects of hip to shoulder, that's what really pulls them apart as far as elastically. But it's now, like I said, at this point, it has more to do with the inertia or momentum through the hips. And like I said, if we take that femur down early, we're going to be able to not build as much momentum, hold stability against the rubber, push against the rubber, build, peak the gravitational pull as you fall down the mount. All that's going to be limited due to the early rotation of the back leg. So at front foot here, even though you can see separation in the hips and shoulders, you're going to see in the kinematic sequencing, the angular sequencing, how things are sequencing in rotation, you can see we're getting what we want as far as right here on the left graph, the red dot, it's the hips, it peaks first. Then the glove arm, which is the blue, peaks next. Then the lead forearm is in there as well. And then the green is the trunk, and then the yellow is the throwing arm. So you can see if we're looking hip to trunk, there is some decent separation. But we got this lead arm in here, which usually that's only in there if it's helping rotation, helping pull that hip around or add more force to that hip. And you can kind of see as the back hip goes through, the front glove elbow is pulling down. They're kind of working together. Okay, so there's separation there, but ideally we'd want a bigger peak, and we'd want the glove and trunk together in that peak. So as much as we're seeing good sequencing angularly, are we seeing it linear? It's when we talk about the momentum, the inertia coming down the mound, we want to see sequencing the same way going forward towards the target. We want to see the hips first push forward, then the trunk, then the arm. And on the right here is the linear sequencing, and we can see the first thing to go forward or peak forward is that blue line again, and that is the glove arm. So the glove arm is the first thing to peak forward, more than likely here as the arm is being thrown forward. And then we see the hip is right peeking forward right here, and then the trunk right after it. So look at the separation difference in the linear aspect to the left, to the angular aspect. So here's, if we're looking at the left graph, here is the hip peak to the trunk peak. A lot more time than if we go to the right graph and we look at the peak, the linear peak of the hip to the linear peak of the trunk. It's a lot shorter in time. Barely any movement at that point. And then specifically when the trunk opens and the arm is laying back or coming out of layback, we can see the trunk is really shutting off. The trunk is getting close to being completely stopped in the linear momentum. And not only that, before pitch release here, we can see, because there's not a lot of linear trunk action, linear trunk power, we're not seeing a lot of forward trunk tilt. So forward trunk position here is still back. So that if you see that chest forward bend is B, that means back. It's still back 3 degrees. And then here at pitch release, it's forward at 6 degrees, and then after it goes to 26. A high velocity pitcher at maximum external rotation, or let's say at pitch release here, would be 45 degrees. So no, and the trunk is the biggest predictor of velocity. So the trunk is barely moving forward here because most of the energy is angular. It's rotational. And for example, if we go back to the beginning of the movement where it all really starts, what was the first thing that wanted to happen? The back knee wanted to rotate down. We wanted to rotate. So the first initial movement was an angular movement. Therefore, it kind of built off of that and stayed more angular, more rotational than linear. If we would have delayed or kept the femur more abducted, delayed internal rotation, kept momentum powering down the mound, and separated out of that movement, we would have then seen the trunk react to all that linear momentum from the stride, and we'd get a lot more forward trunk, which is, like I said, is the biggest predictor of velocity and would have a big effect on velocity. So at this point, velocity is 86 miles an hour. That's what gets you to the 90 plus mile an hour range, is getting that trunk to go forward. And you can even see your front leg doesn't even extend back. So you could really even get more speed through your front leg, because that's another big predictor of velocity. Not as big as the trunk, but that also helps the trunk go forward. That's why it's also a predictor of velocity, because it's supportive of the trunk going forward. At this point in the side bend, it's 5 degrees. So you're not really pulling hard through your glove side, but you don't have a lot of forward energy. So it's not like you're trying to over aggressively go rotationally. You're just going rotationally too early, and then that's not allowing the linear momentum to build, but it's not like you're trying to be aggressive in rotation, which is good. So I think it shouldn't be hard to delay rotation, get more linear power, and transfer that into your forward trunk, and that's really where you're going to make big jumps in velocity.